Another uber-powerful man in the entertainment industry is out. Les Moonves is stepping down as chair and CEO of CBS, facing new allegations of sexual misconduct. Last month, The New Yorker reported accusations from a total of 6 women who said Moonves sexually harassed them from the 1980s to the 2000s. Late last night, The New Yorker published allegations from 6 more women from the same time period, ranging from forced oral sex to exposing himself, even violence and retaliation. NBC has not confirmed this reporting. In a statement, CBS says the network, quote, takes these allegations very seriously. Our board of directors is conducting a thorough investigation of these matters, which is ongoing. Moonves denies the accusations, saying, quote, untrue allegations from decades ago are now being made against me that are not consistent with who I am. I'm deeply saddened to be leaving the company. As part of his exit, CBS says Moonves and the network will donate $20 million to organizations that support the Me Too movement and equality for women. CBS says it will come out of any severance that may be due to Moonves after the completion of an independent investigation. So let's take a look at just how powerful this man was in Hollywood. In 1993, he became president of Warner Brothers Television, where he helped develop mega hits like ER and Friends. Moonves went to CBS in 1995 and was named president and CEO of CBS Television in 98. Over the next 2 decades, Moonves built CBS into a powerhouse, credited with launching some of the network's biggest hits, including Everybody Loves Raymond, Survivor, CSI, 2.5 Men, and The Big Bang Theory. The New York Times reports Moonves' annual pay package is worth almost $70 million. According to Forbes, he's worth about $700 million.
Joining us now is William Cohan, special correspondent for Vanity Fair, who's been writing about this. To the point that Stephanie was just making about how much money he makes and how much money he's worth, there had been talks that his departure has been in negotiation for weeks, and that he was up for a potential payout of somewhere between $120 and $200 million. What's happened to that?
Poof, it's basically evaporated. The reason that, don't forget when the Ronan Farrow first allegations came out, he made clear that, he was told, when he was told no, he pulled back, and a lot of these allegations hadn't occurred when he was CEO of CBS. He had just recently signed a new, like 80-page contract, which very clearly defined the reasons that he could be fired for cause, or alternatively, if he left for good reason. If he's fired for cause, he gets nothing. If he leaves for, quote, good reason, he gets, $180, $200 million. And so until last night, yesterday's bombshell, which was even more explicit, plus you didn't mention my article, which was of his own diabetes doctor, even worse, some would say, I think that has sort of sent everything into a complete sense of turmoil and chaos.
So walk us through that. You're reporting between Moonves and a female doctor.
Yes. Unbeknownst by everybody, Les Moonves has had diabetes. I'm not sure that's necessarily a disclosable a requirement by SEC rules. And in September 1999, when he was CEO of CBS Television, he went to see her one morning at 7 a.m. and she was told...
This is his diabetes doctor.
This is his diabetes doctor, who was then at the UCLA Medical Center, a woman, Dr. Ann Peters, who's a very highly regarded diabetes doctor who's now at USC. And he made 2 unwanted advances. And subsequently, she wrote an article in a medical journal in May where she didn't say his name, but I was told that it was, of course, him. That's basically been confirmed. And she said that he went beyond that after she said no in a very sort of unpleasant way that we don't want to talk about on television.
And could she not say or do anything at the time?
By HIPAA, well, 2 things happened. First of all, she reported it at the time to the UCLA Medical Center, and they advised her, according to her own writing of this incident in May 2018, that they advised her to not go to the police, to not report this criminal event, that he had more powerful lawyers, he was a very powerful guy, and to just leave it alone. She wanted a note in his file to make sure that he never did this to anybody again. It's not clear. I asked UCLA, is there a note in the file about that? They didn't respond to those kinds of specific questions.
There was a criminal complaint that was filed last year, and the police, while finding it credible, while finding it credible, said the statute of limitations had expired. Does Les Moonves have any criminal exposure as far as you can tell?
Well, I'm not a criminal attorney. I don't even play one on TV, so I don't really know.
What has he said about your piece, though?
Well, all he said in our he of course made a statement to us. He denied the sexual allegation, the rather graphic sexual allegation that was made. He did say that he made essentially these unwanted passes, and once he was rebuffed, he didn't pursue it any further. So there's a basic disagreement there. He, Dr. Peters also wrote in her article that he called back the next day and apologized and said he had a problem with women, and basically she said, yes, you sure do. You should never be alone with a woman again.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.